We'll just wait until we get a few more participants on. Well, good evening, everyone. We are about to begin our webinar on school funding inequity, the impact on teachers and students. Thank you very much for joining us. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining this meeting from Kaurna country here in Adelaide and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, the children in our preschool schools and TAFE right now. And secondly, I'd like to acknowledge the elders of the country on which you're joining this webinar from tonight. Always was and always will be Aboriginal land. My name's Correna Haythorpe. I'm the Federal President of the Australian Education Union, and I'm delighted to be facilitating this very important conversation tonight, which is about school funding for public schools. I'm joined by our panellists, Adam Rorris, a senior economist, Jane Caro, Jane is a social commentator, writer and lecturer, Alice Leung, who is a teacher from New South Wales, and Lisa Branch, who is a principal of Victoria Road Primary School. So welcome to all of our panellists. This event is designed to be interactive, respectful and inclusive. And so I'll just work through a few things in order to give you the best experience. There is a chat function which will operate throughout the event, and we would ask that you use that chat function to make comments, and also we welcome you to introduce yourself and to advise us of the country on which you are joining this webinar tonight. If we're unable to get to the meeting, to your question throughout the meeting tonight, then what we intend to do is to download the questions from the chat facility and to post a response to those questions on social media over the next week or so. If you are having any technical issues, please contact our tech support, who will hopefully be able to help you with those issues. So school funding and the deep inequality that we have here in Australia with respect to our students, our teachers, and their experiences in schools. While we've made very important gains over the past decade or so in terms of school funding, in terms of our campaigning. You may recall I Give a Gonski and Fair Funding Now, which have been the campaign brands that we've used to talk about the issues that are so important to us and to our members and to our communities. What we know is that Australia has a deeply inequitable funding system, and current bilateral funding agreements, which have been struck between the Commonwealth and state and territory governments, will entrench that inequality and mean that the vast majority of public schools will not reach the schooling resource standard, the SRS, which is the minimum benchmark of funding. So this forum tonight is going to explore what those funding gaps are, why they exist, and what those funding shortfalls mean for public schools, the real life impact, the day-to-day reality for teachers, for schools, for students, for parents, and for Australia. And to kick us off, we're going to go straight to Adam Rorris for his presentation. Thank you, Adam.
Thanks, Correna. Can you guys hear me? I'm seeing nodding heads, so that's a good start.
Yes, we can.
Thank you for asking me to speak today. This is a report which the AEU kindly engaged me to present. And I'm just, can you guys see on your screen the report here?
Yes.
A slideshow?
Yes.
Yep. Okay, let's see if we can. How are we travelling? Are we at the start? Okay.
We are now, yes.
Right. I wanted to start today by actually reminding ourselves of the first principles of funding. When we talk about school funding in Australia, it's often, it can get very confusing. It's been going on, the struggle for fair funding for schools has been going on for such a long time. Sometimes it's easy to actually forget what the framework was meant to be and what the actual guideposts were. When the whole Gonski agenda came on, and even before that, when state and territory ministers with the Commonwealth were discussing what fair funding would look like, the first principle was that we had to look at a minimum funding. That, to go aspirational was just absolutely going to be too difficult. Schools were too far apart, systems were too far apart, and that we had to start from what would be a minimum funding required to allow schools to deliver the absolute basics. So it was never actually an aspirational standard. It was meant to be a minimum of funding required so that schools could actually achieve minimum learning outcomes in only two areas, actually, in literacy and numeracy. And we had to agree to that because to go further was going to be too hard, and it was also going to be quite expensive. It was always about setting a minimum standard that we could, and a government would have a clear obligation and a mandate to provide. And so when we're talking about school resourcing standard, it's not meant to be an aspirational target. It is meant to be the absolute bare minimum that schools need based on an estimate of what's required for them to be able to deliver also 80% actually of their students to hit those targets in literacy and numeracy. That's the extent of the claim of that funding. And so when we look at the failure to reach schooling resource standards levels, we have to understand that we're actually failing to meet a very bare minimum of what's required by our schools to do their job. Before we actually look at the numbers, I also wanted to look at what I call here the loaded dice, because when we actually look at the pattern of funding and its distribution across schools, and in particular between public schools and private schools, the first thing we need to understand is that the whole thing is actually loaded against public schools. That was never intended to be that way, but there are 6 features which actually are predetermined and actually lead to the situation and the numbers which we're about to look at very shortly. The first one is that the agreements that are in place now between the state and territory governments and the Commonwealth mean that the Commonwealth itself will overfund private schools in regard to their schooling resource standard contribution of 20%. They'll continue to overfund them until 2029. That is, in other words, that's hard coded into the agreements. That's not a rogue result. That's not an aberration. That's not something that it's actually hard coded. That's the agreement. That's in there. It's an intended policy outcome. And at the same time, the second thing that's hard coded in there is that the Commonwealth will underfund public schools until 2023, and that is in terms of its 20% commitment. Nothing about actually, the total quantum and hitting the SRS, just simply hitting the target that the Commonwealth set for itself at 20% as an arbitrary amount that it was going to hit as its contribution towards the school resourcing standard of funding which all schools need. The third feature of the whole hard coding and all this is that state and territories overfund private schools in terms of their commitments to them, but do not reach their 75% targets for public schools until 2023. And that's at best at 2023, they're lagging. The fourth feature, it's a new one, and I'll discuss it in more detail later, is that they've imposed, I call this a capital depreciation tax. They've applied a notional accounting trick it's my term, because it is a trick, and they've applied it to public schools, but they don't apply it to private schools. And I'll explain later what that trick is and how it essentially deprives schools, public schools, of 4% of funding from their recurrent school funding. In other words, the money they need year in, year out in order to deliver the lessons in the program to their students. The fifth aspect is that the agreement between the Commonwealth and the states and territories leaves public schools short between 5 and 20% from minimum required to deliver SRS funding. The sole exception to this is the ACT, and I should point out the ACT is also the sole exception on the capital depreciation tax. All the other states fail in this regard. And the final point is that by agreement between the Commonwealth and the state and territory governments, all private school systems, except for Northern Territory, will be funded more than their specified SRS funding level by 2022. They'll be above that by 2022, all of them except the Northern Territory. That is the result of those agreements that have been struck between the Commonwealth and all state territory governments, irrespective of their political colour. So, the first key finding, and here, by the way, I should point out, this is a presentation, a slideshow presentation I'm making here. It's based on a report, which I think you can find on the AEU website, and I've just simply put some graphics here to make it a little bit more interesting. The first key finding of my report was that based on the Commonwealth and state and territories' own accounting principles, public schools across Australia during that period 2020 to 2023 will be $19 billion short on the funding they need, the minimum funding they need, as defined by the School and Resource Standards. New South Wales, Victoria and Queensland, each of those have cumulative shortfalls in that period that are more than $5 billion each for their public school system. I mean, these are, quite incredible figures. We can return to these tables, but very quickly, what I show in the report is how those numbers break down across states and territories for public schools. You see on the top right-hand corner in the cumulative total, that's the national shortfall in funding for all public school systems across the country. And you can see there the state breakdowns for those that want to look for their individual state and see how they're faring. You'll see that ACT is the only one that actually stands above the school resourcing standard, and they are by 2023 down to level pegging. In other words, they're not collecting more than their school resourcing standard. All the others, year in, year out, are falling massively short of the minimum funding required by the school resourcing standard. While this is going on, the private schools are receiving the exact opposite treatment. Private schools during that period are overfunded by approximately $1 billion, while those public schools are underfunded by 19. The private school sectors, with the sole exception of the Northern Territory, attain and exceed their SRS funding levels by 2022 at the latest. And this table here gives you a breakdown of the distribution of that largesse. And it's quite significant. And obviously, some states are reaping more than others and over the whole time, others are not. But the cumulative total nationally is just shy of $1 billion over that time period. If we want to understand this on a per student basis, and economists do like to standardize these figures so we can have a better sense of what's going on between states and in terms of the impact within a classroom, New South Wales has the highest shortfall, about $816 per student by 2023, and all all jurisdictions underfund their public systems by more than $1,000 per student by 2022 and 2023. The greatest underfunding per student is in the Northern Territory, more than $6,000, and Queensland also comes in at more than $2,000 per student. Yep. And so you can see this is the presentation of those figures. I'm running short of time, and in fact, I think I'm very close to blowing my time limit here, so I'm going to very quickly move through this. Public schools, I mean, there's all sorts of talk of a gold standard by the Commonwealth government at the moment. Well, gold standard, we can't even get a Gonski here. I mean, really, it's beyond disappointing. All public school systems, with the exception of ACT, are stuck at 95% or below that mandated SRS level of funding by 2023. And all private school systems, with the exception of the Northern Territory, are publicly funded above SRS levels by 2022. And that's just the hard reality of it. What was particularly new when I did this analysis this year was the impact of this kind of really sort of absolutely not a bright idea and not a bright spark. But what's happened is this trick where basically New South Wales first, in an agreement with the Commonwealth in order to get their agenda up in 2018, stitched together a deal which has since been replicated by all other states except for the ACT, where the state and territory governments are able to include as part of what we call their recurrent spending, in other words, the spending that goes to schools for their teachers, for their books, for the materials, for the utilities, for the toilet paper, the stuff you use day in and out. They were able to insert as part of that a notional, it's entirely notional, 4% depreciation on their capital depreciation stock. They could take a capital depreciation figure and up to the value of 4% of the schooling resource standard, they could claim that as part of their contribution towards recurrent expenditure. It's wrong, it's inconsistent, and to really sort of put the cherry on top, they only applied it to public schools. They had no inclination at all to go with private schools because they knew what would have happened there. There's no way they would have copped it, so they just palmed it off onto the public schools, and the impact of that is quite horrendous. You can see here over that period, 2020 to 2023, the national shortfall that will accrue to public schools will be just shy of $8 billion through this accounting trick. That's how much that they're depriving, that's the amount of funds they're depriving public schools from receiving in what should be cold cash to actually do things, instead of a trick of sliding over notional money that does not exist, is entirely accrual based, and does not actually reflect anything that reaches any school, any classroom, any playground. If we take that accounting trick into consideration, and I believe we absolutely should, the actual cumulative funding gap in public schools, i.e. their gap from what they need and what the public, the school resourcing standard says they should be receiving to what they actually are receiving, is not $19 million, it jumps up to nearly 27. Not 19 billion, it jumps up to nationally to nearly $27 billion shortage. At the same time as public schools, remember, are being shortchanged this money, private schools are actually getting above and beyond what their SRS level in funding is for that same period, while public schools are being ripped off to that value. I've been doing this for so long, I'm calling this recycled rubbish, because I've been reporting this and I've been writing about this for close to 20 years now. Close to 20 years, it's that long. And the story has not gotten better. The Gonski changes were meant to fix this. They haven't. How do we explain it? The idea behind Gonski was that if there were objective standards, if there was an empirical approach, a scientific approach, The values were put out there. They would be visible to the public, they'd be visible to school systems, they'd be visible to governments. There would be no choice but to actually fund appropriately, fund consistently, and fund adequately. In fact, things have in some ways gotten worse. I'll leave it to others perhaps to go into why exactly that's happened. I'm trained as a political economist, and part of that training always tells us when we look at inequity, when we look at imbalances, we look for power. And the only way you understand these imbalances if you come to terms with what are the interests that are at play and how is power interacting in this political economy of schooling. Very simply, the private schools have got very strong champions who go out rent seeking. In other words, they go out to get as much dollar as they can for their schools. The administrators of public schools, the ministers for education, they come under the thumb of state treasurers, and they are not champions institutionally. They are not the same kind of champions for their schools that the private school administrators and custodians are. The public school champions are compromised by their treasurers because they are constantly trying to save money, save government money. They're trying to save the government expenditure going into those schools. The private schools don't. They're hunting every single dollar, and they fight, as people on this panel know very well, very, very hard and over a long period of time. I think it's important that we think of ways to find a way out of the situation. I think it's a longer conversation, but I think it's very urgent, and I think we need to start considering that. So apologies for speeding along so fast. I've gone way over time. I'll try and I'll hop off now and let someone else take over.
Thanks very much, Adam, and thanks for your research there in order for us to understand how deep the inequality is that is facing the public school system. That data is just so critically important. I'd like to ask Jane to respond now in terms of, Jane, your role. You've been a very strong advocate for public education and as a social commentator. Would you share with us your views about what inequality between school systems actually means for Australia?
Well, it's tragic because we're basically cutting ourselves off at the knees as a nation because we're losing so much talent. We're wasting so much talent. And you can see the results simply looking at our political system and our political masters right now, because virtually all of them went to these overfunded private schools, and they've been overfunded for a very long time. And they're overfunded with public money and they're overfunded with private money. Frankly, if they get much more money, some of these schools are going to have to start painting their buildings with gold leaf because they just won't know what else to do. They'll be shiny. They'll really be gorgeous, if tasteless. However, well, there's that library at Scott's, isn't there? That's pretty, that looks like a Scottish castle. Yeah. Anyway, so it's stupidity quite apart from anything else, because we're not educating our future as equitably or as well as our competitors in the world. So just from that position. And also what we end up with is rule by mates. And I think a lot of the stuff we're seeing at the moment, the cronyism, I don't know if everyone is aware of the $3 million from round bridge valued land at Badgerys Creek and the 30 million that it was sold for. Those are the sorts of things that start to happen more when you've got people who've known each other for a very long time. I still remember when Tony Abbott's cabinet had more men in it who'd gone to Riverview or gone to the same exclusive private school as more of them than women. So we get this rule by a few. And that means we don't get the brightest, the smartest, the most creative. And we've really been very lucky for a very long time on a resources boom to be able to have stupidity at the top and it managed to remain prosperous. But also what it means is here we are, one of the richest and luckiest countries in the world until very recently. How many years of continuous economic growth? 23 or something. And yet we seem to be incapable of properly funding our most disadvantaged students. And I don't know who saw the report last night on the ABC about the Smith family reporting into the inequities in our system and how postcode is destiny, and we have far less social mobility in Australia than we do in many other countries in the world. None of what was in the Smith family report would be news to any of us. But what infuriated me was that it was reported as if it was sort of hanging in the ether, as if there was no cause for this and there was no solution. No one asked what had happened. There was only one moment, and they went to that absolute example of how mediocrity rises to the top in Rule by Mates, Dan Tehan, who said, and I think mediocre is generous, and he said teacher quality was the problem. That's the reason for the inequalities, which is galling, ridiculous, absurd, and insulting on every level. Why does it surprise anyone in this country that if we have spent 20 years driving inequity via unequal funding and discriminatory funding, that we have unequal outcomes at the end of it? It was designed to do this. Now, I was really interested in what Adam said about power, following power. And I've spoken a little bit about that in terms of rule of mates, you know, all the guys who are in Parliament who not only went to school together, their fathers went to school together. You know, they know each other. But it's more than that. And maybe I get more and more radical as I get older because I've got less and less time to be nice and polite or to see this change. I think we have to look very clearly at the fact that 98% of private schools are religious schools. And what we're really talking about is churches that feel they're losing their relevance very rapidly. If you think about what's happened in the last few years, the churches, and this is across the board, all of them, have lost control in Australia of birth, with the decriminalisation of abortion basically around the country. I know South Australia has still got some struggles, but basically it's everywhere else. They've lost control of marriage with the obviously the success of the same-sex plebiscite, and they're in danger of losing control of death with voluntary assisted dying now in Victoria and WA, and I would say on its way in many other states. And one of their last footholds of power is schools and education. So, and we have the chaplaincy program as well. The only part of public education that received any extra money in the recent budget was the chaplaincy program. And I think you have to be deaf, dumb and blind not to read the message that's being sent. This is all about keeping the power of the churches, and that's not really about being spiritual. That's really about the old way that power was organised, probably originally in Britain and now here, which is all about the ruling class and churches and the military and the judiciary. I read today on Twitter, so obviously it must be true, that only 2 of the current crop of Supreme Court judges went to public schools. All the rest went to private schools. So the predominance of people who have no or little experience of public education in the decision-making powers is really quite terrifying. I probably feel there's a real relationship for me in my advocacy about public education as there is with my advocacy about feminism, because I see the same parallels, that there are groups of people who are shut out of decision making and therefore they are not able to get their case taken seriously. And I think that I long ago said that my definition of feminism changed when I realised that it was the centuries-old fight by half the human race to be taken seriously by the other half. Well, I think that's public education's problem too. We are not taken as seriously as private schools in this country. We're seen as, well, they're for the poor, you know, unfortunate kids. They just have to kind of fill out in the gaps. But really the kids we care about, the special kids, the ones that are going to go on and, you know, be the leaders of tomorrow, and they're right, they will be, are private school students. So I'm with Adam 100% on the power thing, and they're very clever. There was a quote from quite a right-wing writer, actually, on a very early episode of Q&A that I've never forgotten. He wasn't talking about education funding in Australia, but he very well could have been. He said, it was PJ O'Rourke, and he said, beyond a certain point, complexity is fraud. And what he meant by that was when you make something so complex that it's very hard to simply explain how it happens, it's very easy to do fairly fraudulent things, and it's very hard for that to be revealed. And I think Adam's example of that capital depreciation tax only levied on public schools, extremely hard to explain to the average person, yet huge impact and complex and difficult. And we've always done that with our schools funding. We've made it incredibly hard to communicate the bedrock inequity in a clear fashion. That was why the original Gonski was so powerful. And the problem I now think is that a lot of Australians think it's been fixed, that Gonski was successful, that they brought it in. We managed to get them to change the rhetoric. When I first started, as long ago as Adam, in year 2000, I got active with the SES scheme from John Howard. The rhetoric around schools was parental choice. That was the driving thing. Now that's changed. We don't hear so much about parental choice anymore. What we hear about is needs-based funding. But what we have is we were supposed to get needs-based sector blind. What we've got is sector-based needs blind. And, you know, I don't want to tell you the bleeding bloody obvious that, you know, public schools educate the vast majority, like we're talking 85, 95% of the most expensive to teach children, those with the greatest disadvantage, with far less money and resources than the private school systems have to teach the most inexpensive, by and large, children to teach in Australia. It is bizarre to me. I often wonder what's wrong with some of these very privileged children, that they need to have something like $30,000 or $40,000 a year, public and private funding dedicated to their education. What's wrong with them that they can't do it properly for the same amount as your average public school, which is what, if we're talking secondary schools, 11 or 12,000, and I'm sure some schools it probably cost them about 8. You know, when we talk about these being elite or special schools, they're actually incredibly inefficient. And the waste of money that is spent by parents, that is spent by governments on ever increasing luxurious resources, because now we have a publicly funded, publicly subsidised arms race where the very high fee schools have to offer ever more luxurious resources to compete with one another for the small number of parents who can afford to pay those kinds of fees. This money is completely wasted. It gains nothing. It doesn't increase our educational results even at the top, and it does absolutely nothing for our educational results at the bottom. And that's why Australia is so falling further and further and further behind in terms of our international rankings in education. Why it is, as the Smith family report has shown yet again, much harder for education to do what it's supposed to do, which is to help people be more socially mobile and have more opportunities regardless of who their parents are. And that all of that is driven by our basically unfair, grossly unfair funding, which leaves Australia in the proud position in the OECD of being muddling around the bottom in terms of the percentage of our funding that we give to public education, and an outlier, like slight years ahead of any other country in the whole OECD for the percentage of public money that we give to private schools. And we are told that governments, it's all debt and deficit and fiscal responsibility, and we can't possibly raise the job seeker allowance permanently because who could afford it? And yet for some unknown reason, we can give billions and billions of dollars to kids who simply don't need it. Adam's report is excellent.
Jane, we'll need
I know I'm finishing. I'm going to one sentence and I'll be done.
Yeah, sure.
The school resource standard is really depressing because it is a minimum standard. And what is even more depressing is we can't even reach that.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Jane. But now go to Alice. Alice, would you share with us your experiences as a teacher about the importance of proper funding for our children?
For me, as a teacher, proper funding will mean that the students that I teach will get the highest quality education that they deserve. So, like what Jane said, public schools do the absolute heavy lifting in terms of educating our most vulnerable students in our communities. So students from low SES, socioeconomical status communities, students who are of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, students from refugee backgrounds, students who are still acquiring English proficiency. All of those students, the majority of them, the data shows, are being educated in public schools. And yet, like Jane said, they don't receive anywhere near the funding that private schools students do. As a teacher, I remember it became such like a start. It became so apparent, and I got so angry when I was still a beginning teacher in southwestern Sydney. Just due to the age of the school, our science labs were very, very run down, and I went to a professional development event at an independent school, and they were able to afford like serviettes with their school logo printed on them. And I just went, we can't even upgrade our lab so that our students can actually do their scientific laboratory practical work in a nice and updated space. And yet there is a private school who can afford to print napkins with their school logo very nicely on it. So yeah, to me, that was just like my first exposure to just the total inequity of school funding. For me as a teacher, also, I guess most recently, my school has seen this massive increasing enrollments, like a lot of public schools. We've got so many students that my school now is basically demountable city. We've got 14 demountable classrooms, and there's no word of how we're going to be, getting any permanent buildings to accommodate our growing numbers of students. And yet the private school that is 10-minute drive down the road from our school is receiving $1 million over in federal government grants to replace their 6 demountable buildings. So we've got more than double the demountable buildings that they've got, and yet we don't get anything to be able to have a permanent classroom for our students. And yet a private school that is so close by has less than half of the demountable classrooms, is getting over $1 million to make sure that their students have a nice space, to be at. And as a teacher, class sizes do matter. I know there's a lot of people who go class sizes don't, but they absolutely do, because for me as a teacher, if there's a smaller number of students, each student will get more one-on-one attention, and they'll get more teacher feedback. The learning will be able to be more differentiated to their need. And I think if we've got sufficient funding, like I said, public schools, and I know from teaching in several public schools, often in low socioeconomic status communities, that they're the ones who need a lot of help in terms of getting their academic results. And without the proper funding, there's a lot of them in class, and teachers do the absolute best that they can. Like, I have not met a teacher who doesn't go the extra mile for their students, but it just means that the classes are huge. With proper funding, you'll be able to reduce the class sizes and be able to get that additional help for those students that have the greatest need.
Thanks very much, Alice. And we'll now ask Lisa to share with us her thoughts as a principal about what proper funding would mean for everyone in your school. Lisa.
Thanks, Correna. First of all, I just wanted to mention that, Adam, it's out of what you said, I think that what we can do is celebrate the amazing job that government schools do, given that we do start with from behind the starting line, I guess. Jane, you know, that comment from Dan Teen's infuriating, and to be pointing the finger at teacher performance just makes my hair stand on end, really. So what you had to say was really relevant to our everyday work. I guess in terms of what we would do with that kind of funding if we got it, it's different for every school, but in my school, I guess really what we notice is that the work of teachers is not only vastly more than it ever was, but it's very different to what it used to be. And so I think that funding needs to represent that, so that we can use that funding to be responsive to the way the community is at the moment and the expectations that are put onto us. You know, now a big part of our job is collecting data, but doing really deep analysis of data, and then responding to that collaboratively so that we can actually design work, not just write lesson plans, but design learning experiences for children that really targets their point of need. Now, to do that, we need professional learning. We need to have access, ongoing and easy access to current research so that we understand how it is that we can do our jobs better. We need professional learning that is more of a package, I would say, that actually where we can look at our whole school, the needs of our whole school and how vast and varied that is, and respond to that rather than just picking up bits and pieces as we can afford it or as they become available to us. Really, I think that that also needs to extend to being able to do that with our ES. They actually work with our most vulnerable and needy students, and they need access to research and training, which we would be able to provide them with better funding. On top of that, I think, you know, we're always talking about time, and it's not that we want more time to do the same work, but we're expected to work collaboratively. And I know as a principal, it's really hard to fund our whole team to be released at the same time for collaborative practice. So some of the funding would be used to do that very work. I guess also it's worth thinking, and this, as I mentioned to you, Correna, earlier tonight, has come under the microscope with the whole COVID situation, and that is what a hub of the community the school is. And that then highlights the you know, variety of work that we do. We not only are addressing the needs of the children in our school, but those of their family, their extended family, their current and individual situations. We need people that can coordinate that work. And after all, you know, to be a high-performing school, you are expected to engage with your community in a coordinated way. Now, we need community coordinators to be able to do that work, people who are focused on pulling all of the work that we do together in a coordinated fashion. So they're the sorts of roles that I think would be able to be developed if we had the sorts of funding that you're talking about. I think we're really well placed to be a hub for our community, but we're just not well resourced.
Thanks very much, Lisa. Colleagues, we're going to go to the Q&A section of the webinar tonight, and I'll just ask panellists, we've got quite a few questions that have come in already, so we'll do our best to get to as many as we can. So if we can keep our answers brief, that will help us get through some of the questions. Adam, I've got one for you, I think, to kick the conversation off, and that is that where did the impetus for the depreciation tax come from? Was it pushed by the federal government?
So as far as I can understand, and in my reading of what happened, in 2018, the government needed to get approval through for its new funding arrangements. And what they ended up doing, that they managed to get that, or part of the way they got that was by putting on the table this deal for the New South Wales government first. I mean, the deal was first struck with the New South Wales government on this ability to include, for the New South Wales government to include as part of its contribution towards the schooling resource standard, this notional allocation of money, which could be up to 4% of the recurrent spend. And this 4%, as I said, is make-believe. It's not real money. It doesn't exist in a form that can be used by any school. It is simply No other way to describe it, an accounting trick. So in order to get them over the line, they offered them this little deal, and it was great. Now, did that come from New South Wales? Was it the Commonwealth who suggested it? I'm not privy to that. I don't really know. But then what happened was every state and territory said, "Yep, that's a good deal. We'll do that too." And they've all hopped in, except with the very important exception of the ACT, and they've all hopped into it, and it's a disaster.
Thank you, Adam. I've got a question here, perhaps for Alice and Lisa, and that is, how do we mobilise parents in the public school system to demand proper funding from your experiences with your local communities? But Alice, do you want to go first?
Oh, okay. So I'm the union rep at my school, so I was able to talk to our parent community in a PNC meeting and unpack for them, I guess, the journey of Gonski, which then became a Fair Funding Now campaign and needs-based funding, and really sort of unpack that, from the original Gonski report to what's happening now, giving some local community examples, that it's not needs-based funding at all, even though that is what we hear. So I think there is a great opportunity for us to speak to our parents, because a lot of them, I guess, like what Adam has said, it is school funding is complex, and perhaps maybe it is made overly complex so that people don't understand it easily, so that they don't get angry about it because it's just so complex to understand. But I guess unpacking it and actually making people know that it is their children who are not getting the funding that they deserve to get that high quality education, to actually agitate that, and to be able to get them really passionate about their child's education in their public school, that they are being underfunded, and the private school down the road is being overfunded, to get them understanding that, and then talking to other parents, and also politicians also perhaps listen to parents a lot more readily, and others as well. So knowing that the parents vote in that particular electorate and then getting to contact politicians is a start.
Thanks, Alice. Lisa, what about you?
Yeah, look, that's a really tricky area, because I'm always very conscious that we don't want to have conversations that lead people to believe that the job we do at our schools is inferior because it's connected to the funding. So you've got to be really careful about how you talk about it. I think it's important to work with your school council, because if you've got them on side and they understand it well, they are your voice. But I think drilling down to what Adam brought, that what does that number look like for your child? Because that's really what's important to people. Most people are not interested in the politics or us as a system, apart from a general interest, I guess, but how it affects their child. What are the outcomes that would be different over their 13 years of schooling if they were funded by a different system or in a different way? I think that reaches people.
Thanks very much, Lisa. Jane, here's a question for you. Many of our political leaders are graduates of the private school system. How do we get better representation and advocacy amongst those who end up making the decisions? Might have to just unmute yourself.
Yeah, well, I think that perhaps some people who have public education at their heart need to stand for office. That could help. And we have a particular problem in Australia, because usually in other countries there are these battles as well, although the private schools are often not funded by the public purse at all, but there's still, aspiration and all that kind of stuff. But often the conservative parties, say the Republicans in America, are the champions of vouchers and all that kind of nonsense. But the Democrats tend to stand firm in favour for public education. The same in Britain. And the Conservatives are very much about what they call public schools over there, which are private schools, and the Labor Party about public education. In Australia, we have a really tragic situation. Our Liberal Party is very much for the private school system, and the Labor Party is hopelessly compromised by its Catholic beginnings, and so it often is more, it finds it very hard to stand up for public education. The Greens do try, some of the independents do try. We have to also get more voices on boardroom tables in all sorts of areas. One of the things the Public Education Foundation are doing, which I'm on the board of, is trying to get people who have a concern about public education to know more about it, to donate, to get more involved. And I think we do need to access our alumni more. And these are all things we could organise to do. They all feed into each other. That's the problem. It's a sort of chicken and the egg issue.
Thanks, Jane. Adam, I'm coming back to you with this question. I've got a question here that says, why is the ACT the exception in terms of the research that you've presented? Is that an ACT government choice, a federal government choice, or a combination?
It's the short answer is it's an ACT government choice, and they've been relatively well funded for quite some time, so that's not a new thing, but it's largely driven through ACT policy choices. It's also a reflection on the relatively lower concentration of high need students in terms of resourcing needs. So you have that effect that comes in, but I think it also reflects government choice over a long period of time. I think that's why ACT stands out the way it does. I think in terms of finding the champions, the powerful champions for public education, I mean, that is it's such an important issue, and it is such a hard issue. I think when we look overseas and say, well, why are the champions there more effective? And I don't think there's a simple answer, but I think part of the answer may be, and I really don't know, but it might be in governance and the governance of public education. If the governance of public education brought in communities at that school level, at that district level, so it wasn't just school focused, but at that sort of closer level, maybe that would create a more sustained engagement and a more an engagement that was capable of dealing with the complexity that is going to be there. So we would not be fobbed off, or the sector would not be fobbed off effectively in the way it was by that postponement of those Gonski targets. When Gillard agreed and pushed out the attainment of those resourcing targets 4 years, that just opened up the door for all these games to happen. That was the consequence of that. When we didn't get that money, then all these games start, and then people, as you can see here, it's very hard to explain what exactly is going on. But I can tell you, because I've dealt with these private sector champions for a long time now. They put a lot of time and a lot of thought to working out how to get that money out in a way that is less visible, appears fair, and yet it delivers to their bottom line in a way that doesn't to the public schools. It happens over and over and over. And I think they have the administrators there, they have their champions, they're within the churches, they're within those sector organisations. No matter how much they complain about, oh, it's just schools and we're not sectors, they operate as a sector, make no mistake about it. The Catholics operate as a sector, independents operate as a sector, and they fight as a sector, and they fight damn hard for that. They have little fights internally between rich schools, poor schools, but when it gets down to it, they're fighting as a sector, and they've got those champions. Our ministers don't, for the reason I said before, don't fight as champions for that sector. And the only way I can think to be honest, and I'm not saying this because it's the AEU Forum, the only thing that has stood in the way of public schools being eviscerated by governments in this country is actually the AEU. I mean, they are the political force that's actually been the last line of defence for the sector. I mean, it's astounding. And it's that resourcing, it's that capacity, and of course there's been an alignment of industrial interests on the part of your members, on the part of your union with the sector, and that's as it should be. There's also no doubt an element of professional ethics of your members who have those ethics in terms of doing good and doing what is required by the students that they have in their care day in, day out. but it's not enough right now. And I think we need to think seriously about how we get those parents in those communities. Those parents are still a majority. That they are more than 50% in every state. Parents that vote, kids that vote, grandparents that have grandchildren that vote. Their kids and their grandkids and the kids that are in their care, the majority of those goes to public schools, and that energy and that clout has got to be activated.
To be, if you don't mind me jumping in,
Yes, Jane.
that was what was in fact so powerful about the original Gonski campaign, was that the Australian public got behind it. They totally bought it. They totally went along with it. They went, yep, this makes sense. What the then people that Adam's talking about, and also politicians, did was they bought the rhetoric. They still use the rhetoric, but they thoroughly and completely warped and degraded the actual policy. And that's the problem with all grassroots movements, that you can get the public on side, but it's the sophisticated machinations of the decision makers that can completely screw that up. And that's exactly what happened.
I think that's a really good segue into the next question, which I'll just ask broadly of you all. And that is the part of the challenge has been, of course, is the government saying that there is record funding to schools, but also that increasing funding will not make a difference. So what are your views about how we respond to that? Lisa?
I go back to my point before that the work of schools has changed, and it's very clearly documented in everything we get from the Department of Education, in our strategic plan, in our review process. It is very clear in there what is expected of us. I think we need to use those documents to actually highlight that the work is different than it used to be, and that it takes a different level of dedication and professionalism by a broader range of professionals to do that work to a high standard.
Alice?
I just add to what Lisa have said in terms of how our work as teachers and as principals and as school leaders have become more complex and changed so much over time. So in New South Wales at the moment, there is a teaching inquiry happening where this week we've had numerous teachers give evidence to a panel about how their work have changed. And every single one of them have talked about exactly what Lisa have said. Their work has become so much more complex, and also more of it as well. For example, data gathering, the need to collaborate, the constant curriculum changes. So with that change, you can only do your work sufficiently if there is proper funding behind it. So I don't in any way ever agree with that funding doesn't matter. Funding absolutely matters, and that is why the private schools fight so hard for it, to make sure that they keep a bigger share of the pie. If funding does not matter, I don't know why they're fighting so hard for it to keep their overfunding. So funding does matter, and just our work as teachers have changed and become so much more complex over time that we need that funding to get more time for teachers so that they can deliver the education that public school students deserve.
Thanks.
I completely agree, and I've used that line for a long time. If money doesn't matter, why do the private schools need so much of it? But I also think there's a simple answer to it, which is that because they say the same thing about we can't give universal free childcare, and anyway our childcare funding is at record levels, blah, blah, blah. Funding is of no use if it doesn't solve the problem. And if demonstrably we've got all these kids being left behind, then my point stands that it's actually being pissed up against a very fancy sandstone wall. It's not being used to actually gain educational benefit. I mean, we're giving it to kids who don't need it, who aren't going to improve, who are already doing well and they're fine and they don't need our help. And we're starving the kids for whom it could actually make a real difference. So it's got nothing to do with the amount of funding. It's how the funding is being allocated is fundamentally flawed. That's exactly the same with the childcare model. We have the fourth most expensive childcare in the world, but parents are totally out of pocket, don't know what to do, kids can't get in, so the fucking funding isn't working. It's not doing what it's supposed to do. So the answer is there's something wrong with the way you're spending your money. It's not working. You're buying crap. Fix it. I mean, that's the obvious thing. Record funding, lousy results, there's a problem. It's not too much money, it's money poorly spent.
Thanks, Jane. And Adam?
Look, not much I can add to what Jane said, basically that. And really, it's the furphy about money and can we spend it? Of course it can be spent. And I would add this, you know, I looked at spending in schools in 2002, 2003. There was prior research that set up the whole methodology for Gonski. We found then in 2002, when you looked at the expenditure of public schools, so basically the slope of their funding per student was basically went the right way. In other words, schools that had high need students were actually spending more per student than schools that had fewer high need students. In other words, the slope of the funding, we would say as economists, was efficient. You're putting more money where it's needed and less money per student where it was needed. So the slope was right. You looked at private schools that went the exact opposite way. Those schools that have got those schools that have got students from the most well-off, the most privileged backgrounds, they're the ones that get the most money. It's the complete wrong way. Nothing's changed in private schools, no matter. Gonski was supposed to help address that. It was never going to fully change it because that was taken off the table. It was going to ameliorate that. Well, it's not really working. And the money is not actually, the critical thing is that the money for the public schools has never hit the levels it required to hit. And the way the rules are set up and hard-coded now, they won't get there. They just will not. It will not happen. And so it's got to be significant change. It's got to be profound change, and the rules have to change. Otherwise, kids that need the education more than ever, as to return to what Jane was talking before in terms of COVID-19 and the fallout of that for families, fallout of that for kids, and therefore the fallout of that into our schools is immense. And we're going to see it not just this year, we're going to see it the year after and the year after that. And without the additional money has now become even more critical because the gap between families and the gap in those home learning environments is going to be bigger as more families go into stress and go into real difficult situations in terms of managing the learning of their children at home.
Thanks very much, Adam. Colleagues, we're almost at the end of our webinar tonight. I think it's been a fantastic conversation. Look, what I'd like to do is offer each of our panellists a 30-second concluding statement. What is the message that you would like to leave our participants with in terms of this critically important issue for our schools? Alice, we'll start with you.
Keep fighting. Our children in public schools need us, all of us, to keep fighting. They need the proper funding so that they can do the absolute best that they can. Children don't choose the circumstances that they are born into, and a high quality public education that is properly funded is the only way to get a fair society that is a just society, and that everyone can have a fair go and everyone can reach their potential. Thanks, Alice. Adam?
Not much more to add. Only I believe majority of people understand the importance of schools. They understand how vitally important it is to the future of their children and the opportunities that they can have later in life. And so that, I think, is the open field that we always need to focus on, because that will help us to win the political battle, to win the real battle in terms of securing funding. I think that's we've kind of got we need to work on that hope and the expectation that people have for the future of their children and the education of the children, and then build our message governments on that so they can become active and demand it for the kids.
Thanks very much, Adam. Lisa?
I just go back to my staple really at my school. The most important thing we can do is teach children how to think. If people thought more, we wouldn't be in this situation. If people asked more questions, we would not get people allowed to just randomly put taxes on us and never be questioned about it. So that idea of us, you know, we may not solve this problem in the near future, but the next generation need to be armed with the thought that they can make that difference.
Thanks very much, Lisa. And Jane?
Well, we're about to go into a period, I think, in world history of enormous change. I don't know if things are going to change for the better or the worse, or whether they're going to get worse before they get better. I'm very worried about the results of the election next week in America. I think that decides what happens to the world for the next 10 years, really. But times of enormous change means lots of things change. And we feel like this is embedded and that it'll never change. My view is it's a terribly inefficient system. It's deeply unfair. And we are about to go into a thing that Australia has probably never really experienced fully in living memory. And that is, I think, much deeper than a recession. I think there's going to be real economic pain out there. And that is when public education particularly comes into its own, because it carries on regardless, and people do value it. They are very grateful for it to be there, and they will be even more grateful soon. So I'm weirdly terrified and hopeful, because change is always very scary and uncomfortable, but it means that something can change really, really quickly that you thought you'd never see. And so this shattering of everything may mean that we end up with the kind of public school system we should have had for the last 30 years, since Gough Whitlam made his very grave mistake.
Thank you very much, Jane, and thanks to all of our panellists for this fantastic session tonight. And on behalf of the AEU, I'd like to thank all of our participants who have joined us on this webinar as well, and also to give you our commitment. We are in this for the long haul. We will never give up because our children need us to make sure that their futures are certain. The public education system is the system for every child, and governments need to understand how important it is that we invest in their futures. And we need to do that by providing the resources for our children, for their teachers, their principals, for education support staff, and all who are involved in our education communities. But we can't do this alone. We need you to join us. Over the next few weeks, we're running a series of webinars to highlight the importance of funding for schools in particular. And you can join us in terms of the campaign by going to fairfundingnow.org.au, but also following our social media feeds. And we're going to have some very exciting news in terms of the next phase of our school funding campaign as we take this into 2021. So thanks very much, everyone. And to all of you, happy World Teachers Day for tomorrow. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Thanks. Good night.